When the house is quiet tonight and nothing is actually wrong, you might feel it anyway. A low, nameless dread with no cause you can point to and no cure you can find. Almost everyone treats that feeling as something to fix. But one man looked at that exact dread and said something stranger. That it isn't a flaw in you at all. That it's the dizziness of your own freedom, and that it is trying to tell you something about the person you have not yet become. You know this feeling, the 3 in the morning version of it, the doors locked, the day survived, nothing waiting in the next room, and still that hum of unease moving through you, formless, pointing at nothing. You have probably spent years trying to get rid of it, numbing it, scrolling past it, waiting for it to pass. What almost no one ever tells you is that the dread might not be your enemy, that the very feeling you have been fighting could be the truest signal you have about your own life, about a freedom that is yours and a self you have not yet let yourself become. So tonight, instead of trying to make it stop, we are going to do the opposite. We are going to listen to it. And by the time this is over, you may never hear that quiet dread the same way again. Not as proof that something is wrong with you, but as a message you have been missing your whole life. The man who first understood it was named Søren Kierkegaard. He spent his short, intense life listening to exactly this feeling, and what he found inside it might change how you feel the next time it arrives in the dark. Not something to silence, something to listen to. So let's begin. You might be wondering who he was and why you should trust him with a feeling this private. Kierkegaard was a Danish writer in the 1800s, often called the father of existentialism. But forget the title. What matters is what he was actually after. He was the first to insist that the deepest questions in life are not abstract puzzles to be solved from a distance, but urgent, personal matters of how you, the single person lying here, alone with your own life, are actually going to live. He didn't write for scholars. He wrote for the individual in the dark, with their own restless mind. He wrote, in a sense, for you. And of everything he thought about, nothing was closer to him than the exact feeling we started with. He didn't study anxiety from the outside, the way a scientist studies a specimen. He knew it from the inside, intimately, painfully, his whole life long. And out of that lived experience, he did something almost no one else has ever done. He took the feeling you have spent your life trying to escape, and he gave it a meaning. To see that meaning, we have to start where he started, by noticing that the dread you feel in the dark is not at all the thing you have always assumed it was. Everything else rests on a single distinction, and it is so simple that it is easy to miss how strange it is. Kierkegaard insisted that anxiety and fear are not the same thing, not two words for one feeling, two different feelings entirely. Fear, he said, always has an object. When you are afraid of something. The dog across the street, the exam tomorrow, the footsteps behind you, the phone call you are waiting for. Fear points at a specific thing in the world, and because it has an object, it is, in a strange way, manageable. You can name what you fear. You can face it, or flee it, or solve it. The dog passes. The exam ends. The footsteps turn out to be nothing. And the fear, having lost its object, dissolves. But anxiety is different, and the difference is the whole point. Anxiety has no object. That is its defining and disorienting feature. When you are anxious, truly anxious, in Kierkegaard's sense, you cannot say what you are anxious about, because it is not about anything in particular. It is not the dog, or the exam, or the footsteps. It is a dread that hangs in the air with no source you can point to. You search for the cause, and you cannot find it, because there isn't one out in the world. The unease is coming from somewhere else entirely. This is exactly the feeling that visits in the dark when nothing is wrong. You lie there safe, and still the dread moves through you, and you think, what is the matter with me? There is no reason to feel this way, and you are right. There is no reason, no object, nothing out there causing it, which is precisely why it will not resolve the way fear does. You cannot solve a problem that has no location. You cannot lock the door against a dread that is not outside. And so most of us conclude that something has gone wrong with us, that this objectless unease is a flaw, a sickness, a sign that we are broken in some way other people are not. Kierkegaard looked at the very same experience and drew the opposite conclusion. He thought the objectlessness was not a flaw at all. He thought it was a clue. Because if the anxiety is not coming from anything out in the world, then it must be coming from something in here, from something about what it is to be a human being at all. And what it comes from, he discovered, is the one thing we are most reluctant to look at directly: our freedom. To feel what Kierkegaard meant, picture yourself standing at the edge of a high cliff, looking down. There is an ordinary fear there, of course, the fear of falling, of the edge crumbling, of an accident. That is fear in his sense. It has an object, the fall. But Kierkegaard noticed something else, something stranger, hiding just underneath that fear. A second feeling, harder to admit. Standing at the edge, looking down, you become dimly aware of a terrible and dizzying fact, that nothing at all, is stopping you from stepping off. That you could. That the only thing keeping you on solid ground in this exact moment is your own choice, and that this choice is entirely, vertiginously yours. That second feeling, not the fear of falling, but the dizziness that comes from your own freedom to jump, that Kierkegaard said, is anxiety, and he gave it the name that has echoed through philosophy ever since. Anxiety, he wrote, is the dizziness of freedom. And that phrase holds the key to the objectless dread. The reason anxiety has no object out in the world is that its true source is inside you. It is your own freedom, looking down into its own open possibilities and growing dizzy at the sight. Anxiety is what freedom feels like from the inside, before you have chosen anything. It is the vertigo of standing before a future that is genuinely open, a life that is genuinely unfixed, a self that could still become almost anything, and realizing that it is up to you, with no railing, no script, no one to take the weight. This is why the feeling visits most in the quiet, in the dark, when the day's distractions fall away. It is not that something is wrong in those moments. It is that, for once, nothing is loud enough to drown out the underlying truth of your situation, that you are free, that your life is unfinished, that the next chapter is unwritten and yours to write, and that this is as dizzying as it is open. The unease you feel is not a sign that your life is going badly. It is the sensation of standing at the edge of your own possibility. And yet Kierkegaard did not think the dizziness was a curse. He thought it was a kind of privilege, the strange birthmark of a creature that is free. A stone feels no anxiety. It has no possibilities, nothing to choose, nowhere it could be other than exactly where it is. The animal, too, lives mostly fixed in its nature. It is only a being that is free, only a self that could become more than it currently is, that can feel this particular vertigo. Your anxiety, in other words, is the proof that you are not finished, that there is more in you than has yet been lived, which is the beginning of an answer to the question we started with. What is your anxiety trying to tell you? So what, gently, is it telling you? If the dizziness rises from your own unfinished freedom, then the dread is not an alarm that something is wrong. It is closer to a message that you are free and that you have not yet become all you could be. But at 3 a.m, you are free and unfinished can sound like a lovely abstraction, so make it concrete. What specifically might the feeling be pointing at? Sometimes it points at a life that looks fine from the outside and feels wrong from the inside. The work that pays well and quietly empties you. The role you have played so long, you have forgotten it was ever a choice. Sometimes it points at something undone, the thing you keep not starting, the words you keep not saying, the version of your days you can picture clearly, but somehow never begin. And sometimes it is subtler still, not a single problem you could name, but a low sense that you are living at a slight angle to your own life, near the life that is yours but never quite inside it. The anxiety spells none of this out. It cannot. It only presses quietly in one direction. Here, look here, at the distance between the life you are living and the one still waiting in you. This is why he could write a sentence that sounds, at first, almost impossible. Whoever has learned to be anxious in the right way, he said, has learned the ultimate. Learn to be anxious in the right way. Not learn to make the anxiety disappear. He never promised that, and never sought it. But learn to read it. To stop treating the dizziness as an enemy to be silenced, and to start hearing it as a teacher, pointing again and again at your own freedom and your own unfinished becoming. Now it is worth saying gently and clearly, this is not a tidy cure, and it is not a denial of how heavy that feeling can be. Kierkegaard knew the weight of it better than almost anyone. He carried it his whole life. He is not saying the dread is pleasant or easy, or that you should be grateful for every difficult night. He is offering something quieter and more durable than relief, a change in what the feeling means. The difference between lying in the dark, thinking something is wrong with me, and lying in the dark thinking this is the dizziness of my own freedom, reminding me that my life is not yet finished. Same feeling, entirely different relationship to it. But that reframing points somewhere, toward what the anxiety is actually about, the self you have not yet become, and the quiet way most people avoid ever becoming it. There is a second idea in Kierkegaard, and it sits directly beneath the first, quieter and somehow even closer to home. He wrote about a kind of suffering so common and so well hidden that most people live their entire lives inside it without ever once naming it. He called it despair. But he did not mean what you are picturing. We use despair to describe a dramatic collapse, weeping, hopelessness, the bottom falling out. Kierkegaard meant something far quieter and far more common. He meant the subtle, low-grade condition of not being who you truly are, of living a life that is not quite yours, of going through the motions of a self that was handed to you or settled into by default, while the self you could have become waits, unlived, just out of view. Most people, he thought, are in this kind of despair without the faintest idea that they are. They would describe themselves as basically fine, and underneath the fine, something quietly aches. He described the human self in a famously strange way, as a relation that relates itself to itself. It sounds like a riddle, but the heart of it is simple and a little beautiful. To be a person is not just to exist the way a rock exists. It is to be aware of yourself, to have a relationship with your own life, to be able to stand back and ask, is this who I am? Is this the life that is mine to live? A self, for Kierkegaard, is not a thing you simply are. It is a task, something you take up and shape and become over a whole lifetime. And despair is what happens when that task goes wrong, when you refuse to become yourself or settle for being someone you are not. And the two ideas turn out to be one: anxiety and despair, two sides of a single coin. The despair is the quiet condition of not yet being who you are, and the anxiety, the dizziness of freedom, is the feeling that keeps reminding you of it. The unease in the dark is the gap between your unlived self and your actual life, making itself felt. It is despair's early warning system. It is the part of you that has not given up on the self you could still become, refusing to let you fully forget it. Which means the dread you have been trying to silence may be the truest friend you have, the one part of you that will not let you settle quietly into a life that isn't yours. And the reason this all rang so true for Kierkegaard, the reason he could write about it with such painful precision, is that he had lived every word of it himself. You might imagine that a man who wrote this beautifully about anxiety had somehow risen above it, solved it, made his peace, learned to sleep easily. He had not. Everything you have heard so far, he knew not as a theory, but as the texture of his own days. And his life turns on a single story that shows, better than any argument could, what it actually costs to stand at the edge of your own freedom, and what it costs to step. The dread was in him from the very beginning. His father was a brooding, guilt-ridden man, certain he had been cursed by God, and he handed that gloom down to his son like an heirloom. Soren grew up under an inherited darkness, half believing a family doom hung over him, that he too would die young. The melancholy never fully left him. He knew the dizziness of freedom, the way you know the weather of your own mind, from the inside, every single day. And then he met Regine. She was young, luminous, full of the ordinary happiness he had never been able to feel, and he fell for her completely. He courted her, won her, and they were engaged. And for one bright moment, the melancholy man held in his hands the exact life most of us long for: a love, a home, a future, everything settled and warm. All he had to do was keep it. He couldn't. Slowly, agonizingly, He became convinced that his darkness and his strange, consuming calling as a writer would, year by year, suffocate her. That he could not be both her husband and the thing he felt he had been put on earth to become. So he did something that looks almost cruel and was unbearably deliberate. He broke it off. And then, to make it easier for her to let go, he pretended to be a scoundrel, acting cold, careless, unfeeling, so that she would blame him rather than herself, so that the wound would be cleaner. He made himself the villain of his own love story, on purpose, to set her free. It broke him, quietly, for the rest of his life. He never married. He never stopped thinking of her. He wrote to her, and about her, hidden inside book after book for years. He left what little he owned to her in his will. The great philosopher of the leap had taken one into a life of solitude and work, and he bled from it until the end. And why does a 200-year-old broken engagement matter to you, lying here in the dark? Because you almost certainly have a regime. Not a person, necessarily, but an edge. A door you quietly closed, or have never let yourself open. A choice between the safe, expected life and the stranger. Truer, one you can feel but have not dared to live. Kierkegaard's anxiety was never abstract. It was the vertigo of standing exactly where you have stood, at a real fork, in the dark, with no certainty and no railing, knowing that whichever way you go, you can never have the other. He did not write about the terror of freedom from a safe distance. He wrote about it because he had stood at that edge himself and looked all the way down. And from down there, he saw something else with terrible clarity. The thing almost all of us do to avoid ever having to stand at that edge at all. Faced with the dizziness of freedom, with the weight of being a single, free, responsible self, most of us, Kierkegaard observed, do the most natural thing in the world. We try to disappear. Not literally. We disappear into the crowd, into what everyone else is doing, thinking, wanting, saying. We let the group decide for us what matters, what is normal, what we should want from our one life, so that we never have to stand alone at the edge and choose for ourselves. We fill every silence so the dread cannot find us. We stay busy, stay connected, stay surrounded, stay current. We measure ourselves endlessly against everyone else. And in doing so, we quietly hand our freedom over to the average of all of them. It is a kind of relief. If you are simply doing what one does, being what one is supposed to be, then you never have to face the vertigo of being a self. Kierkegaard had a sharp and famous phrase for this. The crowd, he said, is untruth. He did not mean that other people are bad, or that you should live in isolation. He meant something more precise. He meant that the truth of your life, who you actually are, what you are actually called to become, is something only you can answer, as a single individual. And the moment you let the crowd answer it for you, you have lost it. You have traded the difficult freedom of being someone for the easy comfort of being everyone, which is to say, no one in particular. And here is what makes this land so close to home. The crowd is not really out there, in other people. It lives in your hand. Think of the last time a silence began to open, a pause in the day, a moment alone in a room, the first quiet minute after the lights went out, and notice what you reached for. The phone, the feed, the next episode, the small, endless hit of everyone else's lives, so that you would not have to sit inside the bare fact of your own. Kierkegaard saw this impulse 200 years before the screen existed and named it exactly. So much of what we do is anxiety management, a way of never being alone and quiet enough to feel the dizziness of our own freedom. We have built whole lives, whole cultures, engineered to keep the dread at arm's length. But he would gently point out the cost. A dread you successfully drown out is also a message you never receive. Spend your life fleeing the anxiety, and you spend your life fleeing the one thing that was trying to call you home to yourself. And he saw with something close to prophecy where all of this would lead. He called his own time the present age, and he described it in words that land even harder now than when he first wrote them. It would be an age, he warned, not of passion but of endless reflection and comment, an age that talks about everything and commits to nothing. He watched the rise of what he called the public, not a real community of real people, but a vast, faceless abstraction, a phantom that everyone defers to and no one actually is. The public holds an opinion on everything and stands behind nothing. It levels every height down to the average until standing out, or standing for something, comes to feel faintly embarrassing. He was describing the newspapers of 1840s Copenhagen. But close your eyes, and you will recognize the glowing rectangle in your own hand, the same ceaseless chatter, the same phantom audience, the same quiet pressure to dissolve into the average of everyone. He saw it coming nearly 200 years early, because he understood that it was never really about the technology. It was about our oldest and most human wish, to not have to be a self. Which leaves one question. If you stop running, if you actually turn and face the dizziness instead of escaping into the crowd, then what? What are you supposed to do, standing at the edge of your own freedom? Kierkegaard's answer was the boldest and the most demanding idea he ever offered. Kierkegaard's answer was that at some point you have to leap. He meant something specific, the aesthetic life, the life of keeping all your options open, sampling everything, committing to nothing, staying free in the shallow sense of never being tied down. That life, he thought, leads in the end to a quiet despair, because a self is not built by keeping every possibility forever open. It is built by choosing, by committing, by taking one of those open possibilities and actually stepping into it, and in doing so, closing the others and becoming someone definite rather than remaining a cloud of someone's you might have been. But here is the catch, the thing that makes it a leap and not just a decision. You can never have certainty first. You cannot stand safely at the edge, gather enough proof to be sure, and only then step across once the outcome is guaranteed. Life does not work that way. The most important commitments to a person, to a vocation, to a way of living, to a meaning you will stake your life on, all of them have to be made before you can know how they turn out. You have to commit without proof. You have to lose your footing on purpose and trust that there will be ground. That is the leap. Not a leap into recklessness, but a leap into commitment made across the gap that certainty can never close. For Kierkegaard himself, the ultimate leap was a leap of faith, a passionate commitment to a religious life that reason alone could never prove. That was his own answer, and it mattered enormously to him. But the deeper shape of the idea reaches far beyond any single belief and belongs to every life, religious or not. Because every one of us, sooner or later, stands at that same edge. Every real commitment you will ever make, to love someone, to devote yourself to work that matters, to stand for something, to become a particular self rather than remaining all of them and none of them. Every one of those is a leap across a gap that proof can never fully close. To dare it is to lose your footing for a moment, but to refuse it, to stay forever safe at the edge, gathering certainty that never comes, is to slowly lose yourself. And this is what the anxiety was pointing toward all along. The dizziness of freedom is the vertigo you feel standing at the edge before the leap. It was never telling you to turn back. It was telling you that you are standing at an edge that matters, and that the leap is yours to make. Kierkegaard returned again and again to one story that frightened him more than any other, and he wrote an entire book circling it, unable to leave it alone. It is an ancient story, and a hard one, and he told it not to settle it, but to feel its full weight. We can do the same, gently, tonight. In the story, a man named Abraham, old and devout and gentle, is asked to do the most unthinkable thing a person could be asked: to take his only son, the child he had longed for his whole life, up onto a far mountain, and there to give him up. And Abraham, this is the part Kierkegaard could never get past, does not argue and does not explain. He rises early. He saddles the donkey. He walks for 3 silent days toward the mountain, carrying inside him a thing he cannot say aloud to anyone, not to his servants, not to his wife, not even to the boy walking trustingly at his side. He climbs. He builds the altar. And at the very last moment, his hand raised, a voice stops him, and the child is spared. Now, the act at the center of that story is terrible, and Kierkegaard knew that it was terrible. He did not look away from it, and neither should we. He was not writing instructions. He was doing something stranger and far more inward. He was asking, what must it have been like to be Abraham in those 3 days of silence? Because by every ordinary measure, every ethical rule we live by, all of which Kierkegaard deeply respected, what Abraham believed he was being asked to do was simply monstrously wrong. And yet Abraham walked toward that mountain in what Kierkegaard called fear and trembling, on the strength of a trust he could not justify to a single living soul. That, for Kierkegaard, was the deepest and loneliest form of the leap. Notice the silence at the heart of it. Abraham cannot explain himself. There is no argument he could make that would let another person nod and say, "Ah, yes, of course, that makes sense." His commitment runs so far past the edge of reason that he has to carry it entirely alone. And this, Kierkegaard thought, is the secret hidden inside every commitment that is truly, deeply your own. At the final level, you make it alone, in a silence no one else can enter, on the strength of something you cannot prove and cannot fully put into words, not even to the people you love most. You will almost certainly never face anything like Abraham's mountain, and may you be spared if you ever do. But you have surely known, in a far smaller and quieter key, the loneliness he is pointing at, the decision that everyone around you gently advised against, and that you somehow knew you had to make anyway. The path you chose that you could not defend with a single reason that would satisfy them, only a stubborn, wordless certainty you could not hand to anyone else. The love, or the calling, or the leaving that made sense to no one but you. In those moments, however small, you stood for a breath where Abraham stood, out past the edge of what can be explained, holding a choice that was yours alone to make, with no one in the world able to make it for you. Kierkegaard called the person who could live this way the knight of faith, and the strangest thing about such a person, he said, is that from the outside, they would look completely ordinary, not tortured, not dramatic. You could pass one on the street and never know. They have made their impossible leap, given up everything, and somehow received their whole life back again. And they wear it lightly, walking through an ordinary afternoon with a quiet peace, the rest of us, still gathering certainty at the edge, can only wonder at. He did not claim to be such a person. He said honestly that he could not understand Abraham, that he could only stand at a distance and stare and tremble and admire. And perhaps that honesty is the real gift of the story. It does not ask you to approve of it. It only asks you to feel, for a moment, how alone a person is at the very center of their own freedom, and how much quiet courage it can take to choose anything at all, when no one else in the world can choose it for you. There is a question hiding underneath everything we have said, and Kierkegaard turned it over for much of his life. If a self is something you become, a task, and not simply a fact, then what exactly are you becoming? What kinds of lives are even available to a person? He answered with a picture that has stayed quietly influential ever since. He said there are, in a sense, 3 ways to live, 3 stages a human being can move through, and most of us spend most of our years inside the first one, often without ever knowing there are others. He called the first the aesthetic life. Do not let the word mislead you. He did not only mean lovers of art and beauty. He meant the life lived for the immediate, for pleasure, for novelty, for mood, for whatever happens to be interesting right now. The aesthetic person arranges everything around feeling and possibility. They keep their options open. They sample. They reach, always, for the next experience, the next person, the next place, the next version of themselves, forever drawn toward the thing just out of frame. And from the outside, it can look like the freest life of all. It can look like a life fully, hungrily lived. For a while from the inside, it feels like one too. But Kierkegaard watched where it leads, and what he saw at the end of it was not freedom. It was a slow, spreading boredom. Because a life built only on the next interesting thing has nothing underneath it to hold the weight. Nothing is ever truly chosen, so nothing ever truly stays. Every pleasure, however bright, dims into the need for another, and the chase grows quietly more desperate as the years go by. The aesthete is haunted in the end by emptiness, by the strange sense that despite all the motion, all the experience, nothing has actually been built. You may know the feeling more intimately than you would like. The evening that was supposed to satisfy and somehow didn't. The pleasure that arrived exactly as promised and left you, an hour later, oddly hollow. That hollowness is the aesthetic life quietly telling the truth about itself. And so a person who is paying attention eventually feels a pull towards something more solid, Kierkegaard called it the ethical life. Here, the restless reaching gives way to commitment. The ethical person stops asking only what is interesting and begins to ask what is right, what they are responsible for, what they will stand by, who they intend to become and remain. Where the aesthete keeps every door open, the ethical self walks through one and closes it behind them. They make a promise and keep it across years, even long after the feeling that first prompted it has come and gone. They take up work, a person, a place, a set of duties, and let those commitments shape them into someone definite, a self with weight, with continuity, with edges that hold. To choose like this is to stop being a cloud of people you might have been, and to become at last an actual one. This, for Kierkegaard, is an enormous step. The move from drifting to choosing, from possibility to person. For many people it is enough, and it is a good and honest way to live. But he sensed something past even this. Because the ethical life, lived with real honesty, eventually runs into its own limit. You try to be good, and you fall short. You try, by your own strength, to be whole, to be enough. And you slowly discover that you cannot quite manage it alone. The ethical self, taken all the way to the end, arrives at a quiet humility, the recognition that you cannot, by willpower alone, complete yourself. And that is where the third life begins, what Kierkegaard called the religious. Here we will tread gently, because he meant something far wider and more human than any single creed. He meant the life lived in relation to something infinite, to a meaning or a ground or a source larger than yourself that you commit to without proof and with your whole being. It is the life of the leap, of staking everything on something you cannot demonstrate, and finding in that surrender a self you could never have constructed on your own. For Kierkegaard, this was faith, but the deeper shape of it, the passionate commitment to something beyond the reach of certainty, is something even the unbelieving can recognize. It is what it feels like to give yourself fully to something larger than your own comfort, and to be handed back a self in return. You do not have to accept his map to feel its pull. Notice only the movement it traces, from drifting to choosing to surrender, from the life that keeps everything open and holds nothing, toward a life that commits, and in committing, becomes real. And notice, quietly, where on that path you might be standing tonight. One of Kierkegaard's earliest and strangest books was built entirely around this question, and its title has become the most famous phrase he ever wrote, either or. In it, he does something unusual. He does not lecture. He gives voice to two whole ways of being and lets them argue with each other across hundreds of pages. On one side is the aesthete, brilliant, restless, seductive, defending the life of keeping every possibility forever open. On the other is a steady older man, a judge, who answers him with a single quiet insistence that at some point, to become anyone at all, you have to choose. The aesthete has a famous, glittering argument against ever choosing. Marry, he says, and you will regret it. Do not marry, and you will also regret it. Trust someone, and you may be betrayed. Trust no one, and you will regret that too. Laugh at the world's foolishness, you will regret it. Weep over it, you will regret that as well. Whatever you do, you will wish you had done the other thing. So why commit to anything at all? Why not float above it all, uncommitted, ironic, untouched, and free? It is a dazzling case. At 3 in the morning it can sound almost like wisdom. It is the same voice that whispers in your own quiet hours. Keep your options open. Do not tie yourself down. Do not risk the regret of the wrong choice. But Kierkegaard saw the trap folded inside the argument, because the refusal to choose is itself a choice. The choice never to become anyone in particular. The person who keeps every door open spends their whole life standing in the hallway. And a life in the hallway, however free it appears, is exactly the aesthetic despair we have already named. Motion without direction, possibility without a person, 100 maybes and not one yes. The judge's reply is not that there exists some guaranteed right choice that escapes all regret. There is no such choice. He knows it. His answer goes deeper. It is that choosing itself, decisively, with your whole self, and then living all the way into what you chose, is what calls a self into being. What matters, in the end, is less which path you take than that you actually take one, fully, and let it shape you. And then Kierkegaard turns the whole thing inward, toward the choice beneath all the others. The most important decision, he writes, is not between this option and that one out in the world. It is the choice to choose yourself, to take up your own actual life, with its particular history and its limits and its quiet gifts, and to say, yes, this one is mine. I will become it. Not the life you wish you had been handed, not the life the crowd is holding out to you. This one, the real one, the only one that was ever yours. To choose yourself in this way is to stop merely drifting through a life that happens to you, and to begin living one you have claimed with both hands. It is, in a sense, the first free act a person can make, and it is available to you on any night you are finally willing to make it, including, perhaps, this one. We have already met Kierkegaard's quiet word for failing to become who you are: despair. But near the end of his life, in a book called The Sickness Unto Death, he went further into it than anyone had gone before, and mapped its shapes with an almost unsettling precision. Beneath all the variations, he thought, there were 2 great ways a person loses themselves, and they are worth knowing, because nearly everyone is living inside one of them or the other, usually without the faintest idea. The first he called the despair of weakness, though a gentler name might be the despair of not wanting to be yourself. It is the most common form, and by far the quietest. It is the despair of the person who, faced with the sheer difficulty of becoming a real self, simply declines the task, who finds the whole thing too heavy, too exposed, too frightening, and so quietly settles for being whatever is easiest instead, whatever the crowd expects, whatever causes the least friction. They never refuse their life dramatically. They just never quite arrive for it. They let themselves be carried along, and the self they might have become waits, year after patient year, unclaimed. If you have ever felt yourself going slowly absent from your own life, present for everything, committed to nothing, gradually dissolving into what is expected of you, then you have felt the edge of the despair he meant. The second form is stranger, and in its way more defiant. He called it the despair of willing to be a self, but a self of your own pure invention. This is the despair of refusal, It is the despair of the person who looks at the life they were actually given, its limits, its history, the particular and imperfect person they actually are, and says, flatly, no, I refuse this self. I will be someone entirely of my own design, on my own terms, owing nothing to anyone or anything outside me. It can look from the outside like tremendous strength, like fierce, admirable independence. But Kierkegaard saw the despair hidden at the center of it, because a self built purely by force of will, cut off from everything that might ground it, has nothing left to stand on but itself. It becomes its own endless, exhausting project, forever defending and rebuilding a self it can never quite finish. Two opposite errors, then, growing from the very same root. One loses the self by surrendering it to the crowd. The other loses it by trying to manufacture it alone from nothing. And between them runs the narrow and difficult path Kierkegaard was pointing toward all along, simply to become the self you actually are, not the self the crowd assigns you, not a self you invent by sheer will. The real one, the given one, the one with your particular history and your particular limits, taken up at last and chosen and lived. And the anxiety you feel in the dark, remember, is the faithful messenger of exactly this, the part of you that refuses to let you settle into either despair, that keeps pointing gently and relentlessly toward the self still waiting to be claimed. If despair is the scattering of the self, losing yourself to the crowd or losing yourself to your own restless invention, then Kierkegaard's quiet word for the opposite is one of the most beautiful things he ever wrote. Purity of heart, he said, is to will one thing. Sit with how strange and how simple that is, not to will the right things, plural, not to be busy or balanced or impressively full, to will one thing. He thought that most of our inner suffering grows out of a kind of double-mindedness, out of wanting many things at once, and wanting them for tangled, divided reasons. We will the good, but for the reward we hope it brings. Or we will it out of fear of what happens if we don't. Or we simply will a dozen half things that quietly pull against each other, so that the self is forever divided against itself, leaning in every direction and therefore moving in none. A person split this way is tired in a way that sleep does not quite fix, because the tiredness is not really in the body. It is in a will that is at war with itself. To will one thing is to gather all of that scattered energy back into a single, quiet flame. It is to want to live truly, to want the good, wholly, and for its own sake, and not for what it might get you. Kierkegaard is not asking you to do more. He is asking you, in a sense, to do less, but with all of you, to stop being so divided, to let the dozen competing wantings fall quiet, and to find underneath them the one thing you actually, truly will. And there is a deep rest waiting in that. So much of the noise we have spent this whole night describing, the comparison, the busyness, the endless reaching for the next interesting thing, is the noise of a divided heart. The crowd is double-mindedness made social. The aesthetic life is double-mindedness made into a lifestyle. And anxiety, in its restless way, has been trying to point you home towards singleness of heart all along. You can feel the difference even now, Think of the rare hours in your life when you wanted only one thing, completely, when you were so wholly absorbed in something that the scattered, comparing, anxious voice simply went silent. Not because you defeated it, but because for a while there was only one thing, and all of you was inside it. That quiet was not an accident. That, Kierkegaard would say, was a glimpse of purity of heart, the self, for a moment undivided. The peace you are always half searching for is not waiting on the far side of getting everything you want. It is on the near side of wanting one thing truly. He did not pretend this was easy, or that it lasts. We are double-minded creatures, and the scattering always returns. But he offered it as a direction to face, especially in the quiet hours. A question you can ask yourself in the dark that is far gentler than what is wrong with me. Simply, of all the things I am wanting and fearing and chasing tonight, what is the one thing? And can I, just for now, let all the rest grow quiet and rest in that? Søren Kierkegaard died in 1855, only 42 years old, worn out, nearly broke, largely alone, and convinced that almost no one had understood a word he had written. In his own city, he was a strange local figure, mocked in the newspapers, read by few, mourned by fewer still. He could not possibly have known that he had just lit a slow fuse, one that would burn quietly underground for the better part of 100 years. Because the questions he had spent his life asking did not die with him. The questions about freedom and dread, about the single individual standing alone against the crowd, about how on earth a person becomes a real self in a world that is forever offering them 100 ready-made ones to wear instead. Those questions went quiet for a generation, and then in the next century, they came roaring back. The thinkers we now call the existentialists picked up almost everything he had buried: the anxiety, the freedom, the vertigo, and the strange gift of having to choose. If you have ever spent an evening with Sartre or Camus or Heidegger, you have been breathing air that this lonely Dane first made. But here is the part that makes him far more than a footnote to the people who followed. They did not simply agree with him. They took his questions and gave their own answers, and often the very opposite ones. Kierkegaard, standing at the edge, dizzy with freedom, leapt toward faith. Camus, standing at the very same edge, refused that leap entirely. He thought it was a kind of escape, a way of pretending the silent universe answers back when it never does. Camus wanted to stay out in the open, to live without the leap, and to find his meaning in the revolt itself. Sartre took Kierkegaard's freedom and stripped the God away from it, leaving us radically, terrifyingly free, and wholly responsible, condemned, as he put it, to be free. They argued with the melancholy Dane, but every one of them was, in truth, answering him. He had asked the question so honestly and so well that a century of the boldest minds in Europe would spend their lives writing back. The lonely man who died certain he had failed turned out to be the hidden headwater of one of the great conversations of the modern age, the long unfinished argument about how to live freely and honestly in a world that hands us no instructions at all. And the very same question he first cracked open is still waiting, tonight, in the quiet, for you. Not how did he answer it, not how did they, But how will you? Near the end of his short and difficult life, the man who had written so piercingly about dread did something tender. He turned away from argument altogether and wrote a few quiet meditations on two of the smallest, most ordinary teachers in the world, the lily of the field and the bird of the air. After everything, the cliff, the leap, the mountain, the long loneliness, he wanted to leave us with something softer. He wanted to show us how to be unanxious. And his chosen teachers were a flower and a bird. Look at the lily, he said. It does not toil. It does not compare itself to the lily across the field and find itself wanting. It does not lie awake wondering whether it has bloomed correctly, or whether it should have been a rose instead, or what the other flowers might be saying about it. It simply stands in the field it was given, in the light it was given, and is completely and without apology a lily. And the bird does not hoard up endless worry about tomorrow. It does not carry the weight of next year on this evening's branch. It sings when it is time to sing, and grows quiet when it is time to be quiet, and sleeps when the light goes, held by a trust it never even has to think about. Kierkegaard was not telling us to become simple or thoughtless, or to stop caring about our lives. We are not lilies. We carry a kind of awareness the flower is spared, and that awareness is the very freedom this whole journey has been about. But he thought the lily and the bird could teach the anxious human heart three quiet things, and they are worth carrying with you into the dark. The first is silence, that there is a peace that comes not from solving everything, but from letting the endless inner commentary fall still, the way a field falls still at dusk. The second is presence, that the bird is not anxious because it is wholly here, on this branch, in this moment, and not scattered across 1,000 imagined tomorrows. And the third is a kind of acceptance, a willingness to stand like the lily in the life you were actually given, in this light, in this field, and to let that be enough for tonight. There is something almost unbearably gentle in the fact that this is where he ended up, the great philosopher of anxiety, who knew the dizziness of freedom better than anyone, who stared down the cliff and the mountain and the long loneliness of his own choices. When it finally came time to console us, he pointed at a flower bending in the evening wind, as if to say, yes, you are free, and yes, that freedom is dizzying, and you will spend a lifetime learning to bear it. But not tonight. Tonight you can do what the lily does. You can stop straining toward who you have not yet become, just for a few hours, and simply rest in the field where you already are. The becoming will still be there in the morning. The dizziness can wait for the light. For now, you can let the day go, the way the bird lets go of the branch when it sleeps. You can be, for a little while, as unanxious as a flower in the dark. So come back now to where we started, to that quiet dread in the dark, with nothing wrong, and the question we asked of it. What is your anxiety trying to tell you? Kierkegaard's whole answer can be gathered into a single, gentle reframing. The anxiety is not a malfunction, and not an enemy, and not a sign that you are broken. It is the dizziness of your own freedom. It is the feeling of being an unfinished self, standing before open possibilities, with a life that is genuinely yours to shape. It is the ache of the person you could still become, refusing to let you forget them. And it visits most in the quiet, in the dark. Not because something is wrong, but because that is when nothing else is loud enough to drown it out. He did not promise to make it stop. He promised something better and more honest. He offered to teach you to be anxious in the right way, which does not mean feeling it less, but understanding what it is, hearing, underneath the dread, the message it was always carrying. You are free. Your life is not finished. There is more in you than you have yet lived, and somewhere ahead of you is a leap only you can make. That does not make the feeling pleasant, but it changes everything about how you hold it. The next time it comes for you in the dark, you might very gently try a different response than the usual one. Instead of "what is wrong with me?" you might simply ask, as Kierkegaard learned to ask, "What are you trying to tell me?" And then listen, not to silence it, to understand it. Because the dizziness was never the problem. It was the part of you that had not given up. So let it all settle now into something you can carry with you. Kierkegaard's great discovery was that the nameless dread we all try to escape is not a flaw in us, but a feature of being free. Anxiety is not fear. It has no object, because it does not come from the world. It comes from inside you, from your own freedom, looking down into its own open possibilities and growing dizzy at the sight. It is the dizziness of standing before a life that is genuinely unfinished and genuinely yours. And beneath it lies the quiet condition he called despair, the subtle ache of not yet being who you truly are. The anxiety is despair's messenger, the part of you that keeps pointing in the dark at the gap between the self you are and the self you could become. We spend enormous effort fleeing that message, into the crowd, into busyness, into noise, and every time we succeed, we lose the very thing that was trying to call us home to ourselves. His answer was not to silence the dread, but to listen to it, and then, eventually, to leap, to commit to a self, a life, a meaning, across the gap that certainty can never close. Because to dare that is to lose your footing for a moment, but to refuse it forever is to lose yourself. So what is your anxiety trying to tell you? Not that you are broken. The opposite. That you are free. That you are unfinished. That there is more in you than has yet been lived, and a life still waiting to be chosen. The dread in the dark was never your enemy. It was the dizziness of your own freedom, the surest sign that you are still, fully, alive, and still becoming. Thank you for listening. If this stayed with you, the feeling it speaks to is not one that gets resolved once and then leaves for good. Kierkegaard never expected it to. He thought learning to live with the dizziness of freedom, to hear it rightly instead of only fleeing it, was the quiet work of a whole life. If you'd like to go further, his books are strange and beautiful and worth the effort. The Concept of Anxiety, where all of this begins. The Sickness unto Death, on despair and the self. Either, or on the ways we choose to live. And Fear and Trembling, on the leap. They are not easy, but few writers have ever been more honest about what it actually feels like to be a person. One last thought to rest on. Kierkegaard once wrote that life can only be understood backwards, but it must be lived forwards. You will not get to be certain first. None of us does. But the dizziness you feel, facing all that you cannot yet know, is not a warning to stay still. It is the feeling of being free. Hold on to that. Until next time.